So today we're going to talk about, sometimes the hardest thing I do is coming up with a title. I mean, I could just call it Prophecy Update. Some of my friends do that and nobody seems to care. Then if I don't make up a clever title, people judge me. And so to understand what's coming, look at the past. And I'll tell you why about that in just a moment. First of all, I just want to say thank all of you for your nice cards, letters, comments, notes, messages, everything about my sister's passing. The funeral was, everybody asked me how the funeral went, and I'm like, what am I supposed to say? I'm happy for my sister. One of her prayers, and she shared this with a lot of people, was she didn't want to linger in a nursing home like our mother did. And she wanted to die like Dad did. Dad was sitting at his desk working on his Sunday sermon about Satan and passed away. And they found him sitting in his chair. They thought he was praying. And she passed away, for all we know, peacefully. And so her prayer was answered. I've often wondered what that transition period is like when my dad, he's working on a sermon about the reality of Satan, and he's with the Lord. And it's sometimes I think the Lord has a sense of humor, so we'll find out what that's like. None of us really know exactly what that's like. Just one quick story about my sister. She was a school teacher for about 17 years, and an assistant principal for a year, a principal for 12 years. She was a principal at the largest, I think it was the largest non-high school in the Indianapolis public school system. And then the last 10 years of her career, she was a administrator. She was director of elementary education for Indianapolis public schools, just under the superintendent. So she touched a lot of lives. I mean, there were a lot of, as you would expect, there were a lot of teachers and people at her funeral and at calling hours. And it was nice because it was a side of my sister that I didn't often get to see. She was principal at a school. They're going to name, they just built or remodeled the cafeteria. They're going to name it after her at, I think it's PS 49, William Penn School there on the southwest side of Indianapolis. And it's a pretty rough neighborhood. And at one time, she and her husband lived in that neighborhood. They were trying to save money to buy a house. And it's a pretty rough neighborhood. And one night, he worked at night. She went out she liked to drink Diet Coke, and she went out to get something to, at the store, and she came home and there was a park there, and it was summer or it was warm, and she had the window down on her car, and some guy forced her car off, followed her, and when she got along the park there, forced her off the road, and the next thing she knew was the guy had a knife at her throat, and he yanked her out of the car, pushed her up against the car, and he was going to rape her. And she said, I could feel the cold steel from the knife on my arm. And the only thing I could remember was that my mother told me to kick him as hard as I could. A guy, if he was going to do that to me, as hard as I could, where. So she kneed him there. He doubled over in pain, dropped the knife. She picked it up and stabbed him in the leg and got in her car and drove home and called the police. So she's not a very, she's just a little tiny thing, and I would say maybe it was having a nasty younger brother that toughened her up. So, but anyway, it was a great, like Sally's with the Lord, there's no doubt about that. So we talk all this time about the convergence of events, and I've been talking about this for a number of years. Somebody wrote to me this morning, and they said, how long have you been doing this? And those of you who've been around for a long time, and even before we helped start the church here, probably 20 years at least, I've been teaching a lot on Bible prophecy and current events and how they relate, and apologetics and biblical worldview and that type of thing. And what I did was, he said, well, you ought to put some of your old stuff into your presentation. And now there's one, I could take that to mean that your new stuff really isn't all that interesting, or we're tired of it. But it's interesting, I did go back to January 20th, 2008. I actually have that on a hard drive I carry around. the PowerPoint that I did that day, the prophecy update. I'm going to show you a little bit of that in a moment when I get there. But it's funny because the main subject I talked about, I'd put slides in about that today. So I guess you could say I'm doing the same thing over and over again. But I think it's important because I think it's relevant to an event in the news that I think is important to Bible prophecy and that type of thing. And we'll talk about that when I get to that section. So the passage I want to just sort of use as a springboard today is a passage I use a lot. I think those of us who talk about Bible prophecy a lot, this is a passage that we use a lot of times. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. This know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying the power thereof, from such turn away. For of this sort are they which creep into houses and lead captive silly women laden with sins, led away with divers lusts, ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. And when you see this truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high. I'm like, that's fake news. That's fake news. And we have issues with that even today. It's a crazy time to be alive. So let's look at some of the things that are just happening, and I'll just touch on things. Now, everybody criticizes the New York Times. I actually like to read the New York Times just because they're a news organization. They have to put a little bit of what's actually true in their newspaper. And usually if you look at an article, the last 3 or 4 paragraphs is where they actually put the truth. The first stuff is all editorializing and that type of thing. But they usually stick a few facts in at the end. But I actually just looked at the New York Times this morning. I actually found they actually have a whole page of something that's true. It happens to be an ad. It's snowing in Colorado. So that's from the New York Times front section this morning. And I looked, and it is snowing in Colorado. So one of the editorial cartoonists that I like a lot is Michael Ramirez at the Daily Signal. And here is his take on the Korean upcoming Olympics. You can sort of, and I just love the way he uses symbols and that type of thing. Here's another one he did this week about the new Olympic symbols. Price of oil is up, and so now it says here, U.S. to topple Saudis in oil output. Record clip. U.S. crude output is on pace to hit a new high this year. So there is, and I think that's good. I think it's great. And I know that if things had not changed in our administration a year ago, that this probably wouldn't happen because there was a battle to keep this from happening. I don't know what to make of the stock market, to be honest with you. If I was that smart, I'd be phoning this in from someplace warm and not, well, it is warm today. It's like, 40 degrees, 42 degrees, and it feels like summer. Stocks headed for a fall. This is a headline from the Wall Street Journal. And they're pretty, what goes up usually comes down at some point. Nobody knows when. Our political system, though, is in turmoil. Now, I won't talk a lot about this. Sarah Carter is an investigative reporter. I think she writes at Gateway Pundit and some other places. She's done a lot. She's done like Woodward and Bernstein work like they did on Watergate. She's doing this on the FISA documents and the FISA unmasking of people within the Trump campaign. And at least as far as we know, there's a dispute as to whether they're going to release this report to the public. And I'm just saying is, why don't they just do it? Dianne Feinstein released a transcript of something she shouldn't release. Nothing's going to happen to her. So would some Republican please just release this thing to the public, let us read it, and get on with it? Now, it may be that they don't want, that it's going to look bad for Republicans. Now, the word I'm hearing is that there are going to be people in some real trouble when this happens. And I hope this is true. I want to see something happen. So I'm hopeful, but I'm skeptical until I actually see the perp walks, okay? Now, our friends up north, and this is sort of the example that I was thinking about when I picked 2 Timothy chapter 3, is the Canadian government. And listen, I love Canadian people, but their main government, the Liberals in charge of, the leftists in charge of the Canadian government right now, are like leftists everywhere. They lie, they're fascist, they don't like opposition, they project. They claim that people on the right are intolerant. When they say that, you know that what they're doing is they're projecting, because they are the ones that are intolerant. And the reason I bring this up is that they have a summer jobs program, and the Canadian government funds that. And it's a little political thing. You know, members of the parliament get to throw money around, and they hire kids for summer jobs so they can pay off their massive student loans that result from the government getting too involved in the educational funding process. That's for another time. But that's what, I mean, University of California, I don't know if I mentioned this last week or not. It's the University of California. I was reading some articles about that. They have like one administrator per professor now in the University of California system. And these people are all making like $200,000, $300,000, $400,000. Well, what does that do? It costs more money. So the government, and so California needs money. So what's California even talking about doing is they're trying to figure out a way to capture 50%, at least 50% of the tax savings that individual businesses and taxpayers might get from the tax cuts that just passed Congress. Because they've got this beast to feed out there. And so in Canada, they have this, and this is an application where nonprofits and other employers can go and apply for summer jobs and to get funding, and they can hire people for summer jobs. And this comes directly from the Department of Employment and Social Development of Canada. And so here's the application, and it includes here, you see a little checkbox there, a little below the middle. It says, I attest. And so what you have, here's what the attestation says, I have read and understood the Canada Summer Jobs Articles of Agreement and referred to the applicant guide as needed. This job would not be created without the financial assistance provided under a potential contribution agreement. Then it says this, both the job and my organization's core mandate respect individual rights in Canada, including the values underlying the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as well as other rights. These include reproductive rights and the right to be free from discrimination on the basis of sex, religion, race, national or ethnic origin, color, mental or physical disability, or sexual orientation, or gender identity or expression. And actually, here is the applicant guide. I went and pulled this out, and it says this, the government recognizes that women's rights are human rights. This includes sexual and reproductive rights and the right to access safe and legal abortions. These rights are at the core of the Government of Canada's foreign and domestic policies. So what happened was the abortion advocates got to the Canadian government, and they have the little baby Trudeau in charge, and he's not able to reason with them. As first of all, abortion is not in the Canadian Charter. Do you know that? It's not. But they act like it is. Why? Because they're leftists and they just make it up. And baby Trudeau is like the ultimate leftist. The objective of the change, the The government recognizes that everyone should have the right to live according to their gender identity and express their gender as they choose, free from discrimination. Last paragraph, the objective of the change is to prevent Government of Canada funding from flowing to organizations whose mandates or projects may not respect individual human rights, the values underlying the Charter of Rights, and associated case law. This helps prevent youth from being exposed to employment within organizations that may promote positions that are contrary to the values enshrined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and associated case law. What are they trying to? They're trying to prevent these little snowflakes from encountering something that might be contrary to the propaganda that they get in schools. You cannot claim that it's anything other than that. So what is a Christian organization that wants to hire some summer kids, like a Christian camp or something? And these people aren't making a lot of money. They're barely getting by. They might be a not-for-profit. And so they want to hire some camp counselors. How are they supposed to go in and attest that they agree with this nonsense? In other words, you want to do it, lie to us. If you can't agree with it, lie to us that you actually believe it. And so it's really hit the press up in Canada over the last couple weeks. Here's one from McClellan's: Justin Trudeau should read the Charter of Rights. Now listen, Maclean's, I like what they write. I think it's a good publication, but they're making an assumption here. What is it? Justin Trudeau can read, that's right. And that he could actually comprehend what's in it. This man is reprehensible. Right-wing U.S. media attacks Trudeau's abortion stance. And so he was questioned about it, and here's a little clip of him talking about it at a meeting.
I think I've demonstrated time and time again that defending rights and freedoms is at the core of who I am, and quite frankly is at the core of what Canada is. In this country, we defend each other's rights, even when they're unpopular, as we've seen a couple of times. At the same time, we need to know that there is a difference between freedom of expression and acting on those expressions and beliefs. And a great example that I was wondering whether you'd bring up is the current kerfuffle around the Canada Summer Jobs Program, and expecting that any organization that gets funding to bring young people through the Summer Jobs Program, which hundreds of thousands of young people go through, will respect the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It does, however, mean, and this is where we get to the crux of the matter, that an organization that has the explicit purpose of restricting women's rights by removing rights to abortion, the rights for women to control their own bodies, is not in line with where we are as a government, and quite frankly, where we are as a society. And there are organizations out there that couch themselves in freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, which of course you're more than allowed to have whatever beliefs you like. But when those beliefs lead to actions determined to restrict a woman's right to control her own bodies, that's where I think we draw the line as a country. And that's where we stand.
Now, listen, that should bother you if you like freedom. Because you have the right to a different point of view. You just can't act on it. You can't talk about it in public. And certainly you couldn't tell a young person about it. That is the essence of fascism right there. And so this guy is a little leftist, fascist, wannabe dictator. Even people, the editorial pages in even some middle-of-the-road Canadian newspapers, Globe and Mail, This lady is a liberal. She supports abortion, but she just said, can Justin Trudeau tolerate real diversity? Because this lady is a liberal, not a leftist. So there's a difference. Trudeau is a leftist. And I had to think when he was talking about that, this is exactly what Obama said about people, that oppose same-sex marriage. We have to get them to change their mind. We have to keep them from talking about it. Remember the quote from Hillary that we played over and over and over again. Long-standing religious beliefs and cultural norms have to change. You can't dare disagree with us. And so they're leftists. They're dictatorial. They're fascist. And as this one headline says, PM's abortion stance defies common sense. This one article, the Charter protects their freedom to dispute the contents of the Constitution and its interpretation by the courts. You're allowed to have opposing views in Canada. But Mr. Trudeau appears to have unilaterally decided that arguing against a right is as bad as infringing it. That's chilling. The Prime Minister is also saying that any argument against abortion is beyond the pale, placing it squarely in the category of legally protected but widely deplored speech, like the blog posts of white supremacists and the ramblings of homophobic tweeters. Conflating opposition to abortion with bigotry is simplistic and no better than demagoguery. It is possible to be against abortion without malice in your heart towards women. For those who call themselves pro-life, abortion isn't exclusively about women. It is about a woman and a fetus and whether her right to security of the person outweighs its right to life. They will always argue that it doesn't, regardless of what the Supreme Court says, because if you choose to believe, either personally or because your faith dictates it, that human life begins at conception, it's impossible to reach another conclusion. And you know what? I am grateful. I am very grateful that people are speaking out against this nonsense, against this little dictator. And the National Post, this liberal person that I talked about, Margaret Wente, I guess. Is that right, eh? She's Canadian, get it? I believe that the liberal doctrine of diversity should allow us to make room for diverse religious and moral perspectives, just as it does for diverse sexual orientations, ethnic backgrounds, and everything. Real diversity should allow for views that are not the views of the prevailing liberal elites. But that is an increasingly unpopular view. People of traditional Christian faith and values are being relentlessly marginalized in the public square. Last fall, conservative MP Rachel Harder was ousted as chair of the Status of Women Committee because of her anti-abortion views. Mr. Trudeau has decreed that all liberal MPs must vote pro-choice. Trinity Western, a private Christian liberal arts university in Langley, British Columbia, is waging what looks like a losing battle to gain accreditation for graduates of its new law school simply because it will require students to sign a pledge saying they won't have sex outside of heterosexual marriage. Law societies across the country evidently fear that this stricture will turn the law students into raging homophobes and taint them for life. And it goes on to say some other examples. One lady who had trouble signing that, she said, it's a really difficult time for us. She's a Christian. We look at each other and say, we know it's going to get worse. In the wake of terrible publicity, there are signs that the government is trying to walk back its new restriction on summer job grants. So they called up the Canadian people that did it and said, no, we're not going to change. The law increasingly exists not to protect minority opinion, but to impose majority opinion. Rod Dreher, writing in the New York Times, said, those institutions that hold to Christian orthodoxy are going to be increasingly isolated and stigmatized. And when you bring this up, you say, oh, you're just a silly-nilly, you're just worried about nothing. And I'm just telling you is that, listen, my Bible says, in the last days, perilous times will come. I believe that. And I believe it's here, and it's coming, and it's increasing. So this from the National Post. The Charter does not protect unlimited abortion on demand. PM's love of dictatorships is showing again. This happens in corporate. This is, somebody made this up. This is a Ramirez cartoon, Google left. In our own country, in California, which I guess still claims to be part of the United States, that's up for debate. There's laws that have been enacted in our Congress about immigration. Our president is allowed under the Constitution to put in place things. And there's a concerted effort to keep him from doing what he's allowed to do by law in the Constitution. And if you don't like it, take the power away from him, go elect people to Congress to support your view and get the laws passed. That's the way the system works. But what they're doing in America, what they do in Canada, what they do in Israel is when they don't like people in government, they go to the courts, and the courts are turning into these little judicial dictatorships. Now, not all of them. There's some great judges. There have been some great judges appointed. I mean, lots of them over the last year. And I hope that continues. It takes time to change all of that within the system. But in California, the Attorney General of California, who was served, I think, 24 years in Congress, came out and said, if you employers, if you help out and give information to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to ICE, we will prosecute you for violating California's laws on privacy. Here's a little discussion, I think that's what this is about, on Laura Ingraham the other night.
I mean, this is unbelievable. The government, again, runs out of cash tomorrow, which means that unless the Senate votes for a temporary spending bill, 5 days, 6 days, 6 months, to keep the government open, all but essential government services will be shut down midnight Friday. Democrats and a few goofball Republicans have decided to hold the entire funding of the U.S. government hostage for a deal to give legal status to 800,000 illegal aliens brought here as minors. Yes, you heard that right. Members of Congress elected to represent the interests of Americans and uphold the Constitution of the United States have now fully exposed themselves as nothing more than a permanent lobby for open borders and unending cheap labor. It is a total travesty. Now, the president, despite not having campaigned on giving amnesty to anyone, was willing and is willing to do a deal to help the DACA people. But he required a few basic concessions from the party out of power, the Democrats, like ending chain migration and the visa lottery and funding the wall that he promised to build. Democrats, not the president, walked away from the bargaining table in an attempt to force his hand. Now, I was thinking about this today. Do you remember who was blamed by the media back in 2013 when a few conservative Republicans, was Ted Cruz and Mike Lee, they were the party out of power then, forced a government shutdown? Remember, it was about Obamacare. Well, the media and the party in power then unanimously blamed Republicans.
The president drew a firm line that he's not going to that he will negotiate, right, but he's not going to do it until after he gets both a clean CR that extends the government funding, reopens the government, and raise the debt limit.
I'm really afraid that these yahoos are going to send us right over the cliff.
What we're not for is negotiating with people who have a bomb strapped to their chest. We're not going to do that.
Well, they were following the narrative set by the head of the party in power back then, President Barack Obama.
When you have a situation in which a faction is willing, potentially, to default on U.S. government obligations, then we are in trouble. And if they're willing to do it now, they'll be willing to do it later.
Oh, a faction. It was a faction. Well, we have a faction now. Chuck Schumer, Dick Durbin, Lindsey Graham. Well, it turns out that Republicans weren't really hurt all that much in the 2014 midterm.
Well, she goes on and has a congressman or somebody on, I think from ICE, that says, listen, if the mayor of Oakland and the California Attorney General want to oppose federal law and obstruct justice, aren't they accused? You know what they're actually accusing Donald Trump of doing, obstructing. We can accommodate them and indict them and prosecute them, and if they're convicted, we'll throw them in jail. And I say, go for it. Enough, okay? It's the, well, I could say a lot about this. Now listen, I don't want to get into a debate about Donald Trump, okay? But I will note for the record that for the first time in 45 years that they've been holding the March for Life in Washington, D.C., a president of the United States finally addressed the pro-life marchers. Donald Trump. That had not happened. Didn't happen with Reagan. It didn't happen with Bush 41, Bush 43, Clinton, Carter, Ford. None of these guys, and certainly not the man you saw recently, who I'm not supposed to play any clips of his I haven't been enjoined from doing it, but I probably could be if you got the right kind of judge. So I will give kudos to the president for doing that, because I think these type of things send a message. It's a bully pulpit, and I'm appreciative of that. Now, speaking of leftists, this is a pastor out in St. Joseph, Missouri, and he has a book out, and he tweeted this quote from Richard Ward the other day. When Christians accept that Jesus was killed for the same reason that people have been killed in all of human history, rather than because he walked around saying, I am God, we will have turned an important corner in our quest for the historical Jesus, Richard Ward, to which this pastor says yes. It is heresy. And here it came from a Richard Rohr's daily meditation. This guy is very popular in that portion of the church. We used to call it the emergent church, the emerging church, whatever. People used to argue, well, it's really, I'm an emerging church guy. They're emergent. And I'm like, so I always would type emerge, E-M-E-R-G, asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. So it could either be emergent or emerging, because it really didn't make any difference, because you were still spouting heresy. And one of the leaders of this is a guy named Richard Rohr, who this pastor loves. And so he got a lot of pushback. Somebody on my Facebook friends list pushed back and said, he is a heretic. And the guy said, no, he's not. And he blocked her. Because why? Because little leftist preachers are just like little leftist dictator prime ministers. They don't like any opposition. They don't want to discuss the issue. They don't want to look at what the historical Jesus really is. They want their mystical notions. One lady responded, I think what Brian is getting at here, folks, is the fact that Jesus was killed for being radical, for willing to dismantle systemic injustice, for being inclusive and empowering, very similar to many leaders and activists in history. I know, what does that mean? It means she went to college, okay, probably graduate school, in a non-business or science related thing. So, because there is a historical Jesus, just like there's a historical Jerusalem, an historical Shechem, an historical Hebron, and that type of thing. And this is from the front, one of the big articles in Haaretz, which is a left-wing newspaper in Israel. And the title of the article is, Dating King David, Archaeologists Drop Bible, Pick Up Science to Solve Jerusalem Puzzles. And so I went through that in another article, and it was written by these people who call themselves biblical archaeologists, who should be called biblical deniers, who happen to be archaeologists. Because this is what they do. They don't want anybody to support the Bible, so they reinterpret history. And as I've told you, when we were in Bethel back in May. We went and Joel Kramer pointed out, here's their drawings when they excavated Bethel. Here is what it looked like. And it says, everybody agrees this wall was a late bronze wall, which means it comes from the period of the time when Joshua conquered Canaan. Following the Exodus and the entry into the Holy Land, this was a late bronze wall. This is from the time of Joshua. You go 2 miles away, and I'm not even, I've taken some biblical archaeology. I'm not trained like Joel Kramer is, but we go to Ai, and there it is. They've excavated parts of that tower. At Bethel, they had to cover it back over, so you only have photographs because it's in the middle of a neighborhood. But at Ai, it's not occupied. Now listen, when the Bible was written, it says that Ai was destroyed by Joshua, and it remains unoccupied to this day. And it remains unoccupied to this day. So they went to, and they excavated it, and there is a wall that looks exactly like the wall 2 miles away, maybe less than 2 miles away. And they say, oh, that's not a late bronze wall. No. Why? Because if it is a late bronze wall, it gives credibility to the story of Joshua. You go down to Jericho and people say, oh, nothing happened here. And you can pull out graphs and charts from the excavations that say collapsed mud brick wall, where it's around sort of an oval thing of Jericho. They would build a stone wall, then they would put mud brick walls on top. And all the walls fell out. When they fell out, it essentially created a ramp that the Israelites could run up and attack the city. And you can look at Catherine Kenyon's own graph charts that say collapsed mud brick wall. And it was an earthquake. It wasn't any act of God or anything like that. So the walls just happened to be going back and forth in an earthquake, and they all fell out. So there's an artifact that was recently discovered in the area of the Temple Mount, near the Temple Mount tunnels, I believe. It has Hebrew writing on it, dated to the time of about 2,700 years ago. So to the period of the divided kingdom, if I remember the article correctly. There's this conflict. This is in Israel. You know, they're building these tunnels, and so Israel says, we're going to build a wall down and stop this. And Hamas says, well, you can't do that. And they're doing it, whether you like it or not. And my understanding is, now I don't know if this is accurate, but I think one article I read said that they're building this around Gaza, building the wall down to prevent the tunneling, and it's costing about $700 million. So maybe we should subcontract out the building of a wall in our country to the IDF, and as they say, get her done. Because they lie. Now, this is leading up to, not IDF, but the people that say there's no connection of Jews to Jerusalem. It wouldn't be important if there weren't Jews. You understand that? If the Israelites hadn't made it their capital. It wouldn't be important to Christians if the Jews hadn't come along first. It wouldn't be important to Muslims if the Jews and Christians hadn't come along first with the importance of the city of Jerusalem. And so they deny that there's any connection between the Jews and the Temple Mount. And this week on the Temple Mount, a group of Jews went up there and they were singing praises to God. Now look, I know they're not saved yet. I pray that they get saved. I think God is awakening things in their hearts. I think this is all part of the end times. There are many passages that talk about it, particularly in Ezekiel chapter 36. I'm going to bring you back into the land in unbelief. Because, I sent you away because you played the harlot here. You went away, you played the harlot, but I'm bringing you back into the land because my holy name is at stake. That's what it says in Ezekiel chapter 36. And then when you're back, then I will give you a new heart. So when you read some of these prophecies of Ezekiel, you need to understand that they cover a long period of time. I'll bring you back in the land, then I'll give you a new heart. It doesn't mean that you come back into the land, you get the new heart right away. You understand that there's sometimes a time gap in those prophecies. So here is the Muslim Waqf published this in 1924, Al-Haram al-Sharif for Jerusalem. And in this, it says the Haram historical sketch. Now, this is the Waqf today will say no connection between the Jews and the Temple Mount. And this article clearly says the site is one of the oldest in the world. Its sanctity dates from the earliest, perhaps from prehistoric times. Its identity with the site of Solomon's temple is beyond dispute. This, too, is the spot, according to the universal belief, on which David built there an altar unto the Lord that offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. This is what we, in the law, would call a prior inconsistent statement. And when you have somebody, cross-examination of a witness, the best explanation I ever heard was a former U.S. attorney at a conference in Sacramento. And he said, what you do as a lawyer, you want to get information from a person, and you want to build a way to cross-examine them at trial. And so in civil cases, we take depositions. He said, so what you do is you just go in and be nice to the guy and get a lot of information and ask him questions during his deposition, but you need to show him who's boss. And so what you do is you get information from him and you build a tree of information. And then you go to the tree and you break off a little twig of what he said, take it, shove it through his head, grab on the other side, and then steer him for the next hour to show him who's in charge. So if you were deposing somebody from the Muslim Waqf, this would be a great twig to steer them. And then he said, then you calm down and you build more of the tree, and then you break off another twig. And so I think it's one of the best examples of cross-examination. Now, I would never do that, but it is a good way. So anyway, so last week I mentioned this, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, who hates Israel, he hates Jews. Let's just get this off on the table. Jerusalem is the gate to peace and war. And they had a meeting of the Palestinian Central Council this week, agreeing that they would no longer recognize Israel. And they were upset. They're upset because Trump has set all of this stuff in motion. He's recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. One analysis, Abbas speech, Palestinian president talks tough but is thin on strategy. Aside from, I think you should say attacking Trump, Abbas spelled out, mainly for his own followers, that his conscience was clear. He called the Oslo Accords dead. He said something to the effect, may your house be destroyed, about Trump. So Caroline Glick, who now is writing her midweek column at Breitbart, this is her column in the Jerusalem Post. But I'm going to read just part of this because I think it gives a good history of what's been going on there. And it shows the fact that the world is just wringing their hands over this issue of Jerusalem, which is really what Bible prophecy said would happen in the end times. For 25 years, Abbas and his predecessor, Yasser Arafat, and the PLO Fatah and the Palestinian Authority more generally have not hidden the fact that they are Israel's enemies. They have said outright that they will never make peace with Israel and seek our destruction. And for 25 years, our media and security and political elites have made excuses for them. Right after Arafat signed the initial Oslo Accord on the White House lawn on September 13th, 1993, I was actually in Washington, D.C. that day, he jetted off to give a speech at a mosque in Johannesburg, South Africa. A courageous member of the Jewish community recorded the speech. Arafat told the faithful that the peace process was a Quran-inspired ruse. He was simply following the example that the Prophet Muhammad set with the Qurayshi tribe of Jews in Arabia. When Muhammad started out, the Jews of Quraysh were more powerful than he, so he signed a peace deal with them. With the balance of power shifted in his favor, he invaded their territory and annihilated them. This is called a hudna. When news of Arafat's Johannesburg speech reached Israel, the media, along with then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and then Foreign Minister Shimon Peres, were quick to dismiss its importance. What did you expect Arafat to say, our betters sneered? Did you expect him to be a Zionist? And anyway, what does it matter what he says? If he so much tries to continue his terrorism, we'll crush him like a bug and send him packing to Tunis. And when the suicide bombers started exploding on buses and cafes, they said it wasn't Arafat, they said it was Hamas. And when Arafat rejected then Prime Minister Ehud Barak's peace and statehood offer at Camp David in 2000, the media said it was Barak's fault. He was not rude and domineering. The two men just didn't have the right chemistry. And when Arafat launched the largest terrorist campaign against Israel in its history, our elite said Arafat was a patsy. He was too weak to stop the attack, so we shouldn't blame him. And then they turned around and said that Arafat was the only one who could stop the attack, so we needed to be nice to him. Finally, they said, true, Arafat was our enemy, but it didn't matter because Abbas was replacing him, and Abbas was a real peacemaker. And this analysis, I think this is from Haaretz. Trump's catch-22 with Iran, and the Palestinians could blow up in Israel's face. So it's all Trump's fault. Just like in the missile warning, who was it? Jamie Lee Curtis tweeted, oh, that's Trump's fault. Well, if there's a missile coming from North Korea, whose fault is it? Caroline continues. And when Abbas wouldn't make peace, it was our fault. And when he finally financed Hamas and paid $100 million a year to terrorists, he had no choice. If he didn't finance terrorism, he would be overthrown. And when he incited terrorism and said Jews were poisoning Palestinian wells and polluting the Temple Mount with their filthy feet, well, he was hopeless and frustrated. Anyway, he's really old. The thing of it is that the public has never bought these excuses. Rabin was elected on an anti-PLO platform in 1992. And despite the fact that the media and the left said the entire right wing was responsible for Rabin's assassination in November 1995, the public's desire not to be associated with the murder couldn't surpass its desire not to be murdered. So less than 6 months after Rabin was killed, the public voted in the Likud and Benjamin Netanyahu. But the media believed their fake news, and so do their favorite politicians. Less than 24 hours after Abbas delivered his latest anti-Jewish screed, former Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni and Barak himself, Ehud Barak, were giving speeches and statements blaming everything on the political right. And so we have this eternal conflict that goes on, and I talked about this last year about Hebron and why it matters and why you need to understand the history of what happened there so you can understand what's going on. And so today, and what happened there was that they bought a burial place. And when the children of Jacob, when Joseph was taken into captivity in Egypt, and they went there for 400 years, when Jacob died in Egypt, they brought him back to Hebron and buried him, and Joseph was there. And Joseph told the children of Israel, when I die, and you go back to the land, because you will go back to the land, take my bones with you. And they did take his bones with them, and they buried him in Shechem. And to this day, we couldn't go when we were there because it really wasn't safe. But about once a month, they are able to get about 1,000 people in there in the middle of the night into Shechem, and they worship at Joseph's tomb. Now, it's interesting. I mentioned earlier that someone wrote to me this morning and said, when did you start doing this? So I went back and I looked up January 20th, 2008, 10 years and 1 day ago. And some of you remember that's my title. That was my signature slide back in those days before I went to the fuse going down into the Middle East. The Bible, newspapers, time clock, I think it captured it. On that day, I actually used this slide of what somebody says that, and this is in 2008. Somebody had drawn this up in 2006 or 7 about really how would we split up the Middle East if we could do it the right way, instead of the Sykes-Picot way. And look at how interesting this is. Up here, it still has Syria. They missed that one. But they have a Sunni Iraq and an Arab Shia state. Does that not sort of comport with the conflict that's going on there? Look up here, Free Kurdistan. And you'll see that in just a moment, that's in the news. In Yemen, they have an Islamic sacred state. Greater Jordan. Very interesting concept back then. And what I covered that Sunday was that week, the same week 10 years ago that we're here, our president, George Bush, 43, went to the Middle East. And when they my recollection is when they tried to go to Ramallah, the weather was really weird. And my friend Bill Caney was on that trip. And he said he sat next to a White House correspondent for Al Arabiya, top TV network in several Middle Eastern countries owned by a wealthy Saudi. On Tuesday afternoon, his seatmate commented to me how strange the weather was that day. She said that there was strong rain in Dubai that shut down city traffic for a while, cold throughout the Middle East, snow flurries and bitter cold in Riyadh, and a major snowstorm in the northeast U.S. She said a U.S. Embassy staff member in Saudi Arabia told her that the weather the week before arrival was summer-like. She asked me with much curiosity, could this be God? And you know what Bill's comment would be when Bush is running around trying to divide up Israel. And so that Sunday, I decided it would be important to talk about Shechem, Hebron, Mount Moriah, Jerusalem. So I guess you could say, you're still talking about the same stuff 10 years later. Nothing ever changes. The difference is I've now been to Shechem. I've now been to Hebron. I think I understand a little bit more. And I had these slides, a picture of an ancient Hebron and what it looked like. This is Hebron today. And in the middle, let's see here. So here is the Tell of Shechem, right in here. And you can go there. It sits between two mountains. This is Mount Gerizim here. And then there's a valley. And there is Mount Ebal right here. It's a natural amphitheater. This is looking, what you see up here at the top, that's the Mediterranean from Google Earth. Near Shechem is a well that Jacob bought. And you can go to that well. It's called Jacob's Well. It's in a Greek Orthodox church. You can go down there. You can drop a stone or pour water down there. And it takes about 4 or 5 seconds before it hits the water. The scripture describes it as a very deep well. Now I'm saying if it takes 4 or 5 seconds to fall into the water from where you're starting, that's a pretty deep well. So here is Shechem, and at Shechem you can see the standing stone of Joshua. You can see the temple fortress, and what Joshua did was he brought the children of Israel. He put half of them here on Mount Ebal. He put half of them here. The ones on Ebal shouted the curses, and there were probably 1 million people or more on each mountain. These mountains right here, this area is about 1 mile apart right here. So it's a natural amphitheater. And then right here, just very close to the Tell, is Joseph's tomb, and that's where they were there today. This is what the temple fortress would have looked like at the time. This is what Joseph's tombs looked like about 4 years ago. They set it on fire. Because they're trying to erase the history. We couldn't go there when we were there just because everybody was kind of fired up because of the Trump visit. You can only imagine what it would be like if he went now. Melanie Phillips has a great article. You can read this, that Palestinianism is over. Someone please tell the British. And I'm still sort of playing in my mind how this plays into Bible prophecy. I do think the prophecies that relate to Edom relate to the Palestinian people. You can read about those in Obadiah. You can also get some sense of where it's going in Ezekiel chapter 36. Because it says there will be a people in the last days that will occupy the mountains of Israel. And they'll be haughty and proud, and they'll say, we occupy it, it's our land, you can't have it. Now, I think my personal opinion is that it is a picture of what's going on today with the Palestinian people. And at some point, this has to be dealt with. And it'll either be dealt with by Israel or by God himself. And that's Obadiah. And the flash forward preview of that passage in Obadiah is it doesn't turn out well for them. You sit in the heights like the eagle, and I'll bring you down. The eagle being the symbol that's on the Palestinian flag and shield. I don't think it's a mistake. One other thing that came out this week was, so it just, to back up for a second. So 10 years ago, I was talking about Shechem in Hebron, and I'm still talking about it. And if I'm doing this in 10 years, I'll probably still be talking about it. But it will only be more acute then than it was 10 years ago. The other thing I talked about in that update was that, well, let me do a little lead into this. There's a report out from Open Doors USA. You can look it up, World Watch List. They go through and they did a survey and they found major trends in Christian persecution. And here's what they said. Spread of radical Islam. 2, the rise of religious nationalism. And 3, intense persecution in Central Asia. Now, so they look and they identify the 50 countries in which persecution of Christians is most acute. And look where they are. And so what you see is that, for example, number 1 is North Korea. And there are others you see, like number 39 is the Palestinian territories. And what you find is that in every case, almost every case, what is the main core problem? Islam. The other problem is communism, leftism. And we've talked about this red-green alliance, which seems to be it doesn't seem like it should, but it's happening. It's right in front of us, and you get maps like this. And then some of the other countries, like Mexico and Colombia, it can be political unrest, but those are also heavily Roman Catholic countries. Indonesia, Malaysia, you have Laos and Vietnam. That's communism, of course, China. And then you have the Stan republics there in Central Asia, these countries right up in here, which seem to be included in the Ezekiel 38, 39 attack on Israel in the last days. Pence is in Israel right now, or just landing tonight, probably almost right now as we speak. The Arab members of the Knesset are going to boycott his speech. It's all over the front page. This was something I mentioned we were going to do, is that Turkey is attacking the Kurdish. When Syria fell apart, the Kurds moved into northern Syria. Turkey doesn't like that, so they're attacking the Kurds. And we're there trying to prop up the people to prevent Syria from taking over the whole thing, and the whole thing, and prevent Iran from having their land bridge completely, and that's in the news. Okay, yeah, they were. There were a lot of films. I didn't have time to pull the clips out of people that were the Turkish army and military was coming across the border, coming to the border. Brian says they've now gone across the border. And this is, remember the graphic I used a couple weeks ago, the powder keg? It's still a powder keg. And there's some conflict between Russia and Turkey. And this alliance that we have, I think, coming in Ezekiel 38, 39 is kind of loosely done. I don't know exactly when that thing is going to happen. I'm sure that it happens before the Lord returns. There is another Gog-Magog war talked about in Revelation, but I think that's a different war. And you can have a different opinion on that. I won't judge you for that. I just think that I think there's some distinctions between them. That's for a whole nother talk. Here's the other thing that I talked about 10 years and one day ago. There was an article or a paper put out by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and it was called this, Iran, Israel, and Nuclear War. And it had some very interesting findings in it. It talked about, hypothetically, what happens if there's a nuclear exchange between Israel and Iran. And it's just interesting that we're sort of still talking about this, right? In fact, the Financial Times reported this week, Europe sharpens focus on Tehran missiles. And we need to think about this. So there was this Iranian-Israeli exchange, and I just think we know what happens in Ezekiel 38. For lack of summary, Israel wins. But this is the secular view, and I just want to point this out to you, and then we'll be done. So if there's an exchange, this is what they projected, that Iran would inflict 200 to 800,000 prompt in the first 21 days. 200,000 to 800,000 Israelis would be killed. Long-term death rate cannot be calculated. But Iranian recovery from what was coming their way is not possible in normal sense of the term. Now, Israel would inflict 16 to 28 million prompt to 21-day dead in Iran. Long-term death rate cannot be calculated. Israeli recovery theoretically possible in population and economic terms. That sound a little bit like the outcome of an Ezekiel 38-39 war. The other thing that was in this that was interesting is Syria. 1 megaton strike on Damascus. Where does Israel keep attacking right now? Damascus. At some point, I think Israel just says, enough, okay? There's a passage in Isaiah chapter 17 that I don't think has been fulfilled yet. It talks about the destruction of Damascus. Now, a lot of it's been destroyed, half of it. And so in that thing, they talked about the Syrian wildcard Israeli exchange. So 10 years ago, the secular organization was looking at things that lined up with Bible prophecy. And I brought it up because I thought, this lines up with Bible prophecy. This is important to talk about. And here we are 10 years and one day later, and I think it's still important to look at. And so what they projected back in November 2007 when they published this, Syrians would inflict 200 to 8,000 prompt to 21-day dead. Long-term death rate cannot be calculated. Syrian recovery, not possible in the normal sense of the term. It sounds like Damascus gets wiped out. And I've read about that. Israel would inflict 6 million to 18 million prompt to 21-day dead. Long-term death rate cannot be calculated. Israel recovery very possible in population and economic terms in exchange with Syria. So, 10 years ago, we were talking about it, and we're still talking about it. I talked a little bit about the missile thing last week. I just didn't have time to analyze it. It's very this shooting down the missiles. There's some theories that we shot down a missile, and some people saw it as something below up in the sky. And it's possible. I mean, at the terminal point, near the terminal point of a missile coming in, it is possible to shoot it down. But shooting it on the way up or mid-flight is really not possible. That's what the Defense One article says, and I think that's probably true. And then rumors of war. We're preparing for war. Tehran says, you go in there, it'll be war. You go into Syria, or you stay there. So this is what the Bible says. This is what Jesus prophesied. This is what was talked about. And so we're going to talk about it, continue to talk about it. So let's pray, and we'll go on. Father, thank you for the promise of your word so that we can understand the times in which we live, so that we won't be distressed, but that we'll use that as motivation to share the gospel with those who do not believe, and whose entry into eternity is not only certain, but possibly very close. Give us those opportunities to share the gospel with those around us. In Jesus' name, amen.